The drought of 2012 is in many ways a record breaker. In Missouri and several other states, crop and pasture losses are creating havoc for farmers and eventually maybe consumers. We'll find out more about the effects of the drought with one of our nation's leading economists next on Show Me Ag. Welcome to Show Me Ag. I'm your host, Kyle Vickers. Thanks for joining us. The drought this summer has been devastating to crops and pasture and livestock. It's spread over the Midwest and enveloped the world's breadbasket. Prices have exploded, setting new records for some basic commodities and creating worldwide shortages of staple crops. This is going to be a tough year for many farmers, and consumers may feel the pinch as well. We have with us Pat Westhoff, who has been here a guest before, and he is the head of the Food and Agriculture Policy Research Institute, headquartered in Columbia, Missouri, and he advises government agencies and industry on food policy issues. Thanks for joining us tonight. And we normally have you in January and kind of do a forecasting for the new year, but boy, so many things have changed this summer that I wondered if you would come, and thank you so much for coming in here for this conversation. It's really been a tough year over much of the Midwest, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's an incredibly tough year for a lot of folks throughout this part of the country. And
so it's going to create some shortages, all kinds of speculation about where we're going to end up. What's our crop really like?
Yeah, we're going to have a very sharply reduced corn crop, probably the worst corn crop relative to trend in several decades. We're looking at about a 25% reduction in corn crop this year for the country as a whole compared to what it would have been with a normal crop. Here in Missouri, maybe a cut of up to half for a lot of producers or more.
And soybeans as well.
Soybeans are cut as well, maybe not quite as much here in Missouri as the corn crop is, but definitely major losses for soybeans as well.
You know, I talk to people and they say, well, we don't eat corn other than sweet corn in the summer, or we don't eat soybeans, but really they do, don't they?
There are very few products you buy at a grocery store that haven't had some touch with the corn sector or the soybean sector.
I think I read that an egg is basically 70% corn, so if you buy eggs or milk, you're buying some corn products, aren't you?
That's right. Yeah, all the major meat and poultry items are going to be a mix of corn and soybean meal.
When we talked last January, we were looking at projected prices and projected acreage and so on. How did all that turn out?
Things have changed. Obviously, with the short crop this year, we have a lot higher prices than we would have anticipated a few months ago, even a few weeks ago, for corn, soybeans, and a number of other products. So we're looking at, instead of price declines this fall, as we would have anticipated back in January, sharply higher prices for the crops that farmers are harvesting this fall.
And we've set some new records, I believe, at least for soybeans and maybe for corn.
Yeah, that's right. For both corn and soybeans, last year prices were record highs, and we're going to top those records this year.
So is the consumer eventually going to feel that?
The consumer will eventually feel that. We were actually looking at lower food price inflation a few months ago, and the actual year-over-year increase in consumer food prices has been slowing in recent months, but that's going to turn around shortly, and we will probably see higher food price inflation in 2013.
What about some of the meat sector? That's going to work its way into the meat prices as well, isn't it?
That's right. In the very short run, we don't see a big effect on consumer meat prices, but as livestock farmers are losing money, they're going to cut back on production from what it would have been, and that'll mean higher prices for consumers next year.
I mentioned that this area of the Midwest that was hit by the drought is really the world's breadbasket. Has a big share of the world's food supply, really, doesn't it?
That's right.
Are other areas in the world hit with some problems as well?
Yeah, there's been some problems with the wheat crop in Russia, Ukraine, and some other parts of Eastern and Central Europe. But other than that, for the most part, it's been a reasonably decent year in most of the world. Last year's soybean crop was reduced in South America. How good this year's crop turns out to be will be very, very important for those markets going forward.
To remind viewers, they're on the opposite side. They're planting now, and we'll be harvesting in what is our spring.
That's right.
And they're probably going to increase acreage as much as possible.
They're increasing acreage, and again, if they get a better yield this year than they got last year, that'll be a lot of supplies coming on the market in just a few months' time.
Give us an idea first, maybe, what is I know that the USDA is looking at the carryover, which means how much crop is left at the end of the year after all the livestock is fed and so on and so forth. What does this mean in terms of the carryover? How much corn supply are we actually going to have?
Yeah, we have a very tight corn supply right now. Given the most recent projections from USDA, we have less than a month's worth of corn expected to be on hand at the end of this next marketing year. That's far tighter than it's been any time recently.
That's really kind of scary, isn't it?
It is very scary. It also means that because it's so tight, that any piece of news, either positive or negative, is going to have a big market effect.
Makes it an extremely volatile market, doesn't
It's
it?
an extremely volatile market.
That's really kind of scary that a commodity as basic as corn, and really soybeans and wheat are kind of similar, down to a month's supply worldwide.
Yeah, it's incredibly tight here in the United States in particular. The world supply is not quite as tight because some other countries are holding a little more grain than we are, but it's still far tighter than it's been recently.
I know this causes some concern. Is there going to be hunger? Is there going to be more hunger in the world because of this problem?
The one good thing that's happened this year is we haven't seen quite the same problems for wheat and rice as we've seen for corn. And most of the world's population uses either wheat or rice as a staple food. So while they've seen food price increases, they haven't been as sharp as they were in 2008.
So we use a lot of corn. Well, give us a rundown a little bit about the uses for corn and where it's going.
Sure. In a good year, we'll produce 13 or so billion bushels of corn. In a typical year, we might use about 5 billion bushels to feed livestock, direct feed to livestock. About 5 billion bushels that go into the front end of an ethanol plant, some of which made into ethanol, some of which comes out the back end as a livestock feed. And the rest is used for various food uses and or exporting.
A lot of corn sugar, corn oil
Right.
goes into a lot of basic food products in a grocery store, doesn't it?
That's right.
Let's talk a little bit. I know there's been some calls that we're using ethanol. I think Missouri's got a 10% mandate. Most of this, is that a national mandate?
There's a renewable fuel standard that requires a certain level of ethanol use nationwide.
And so some people are calling for reducing the ethanol use. Can you tell us a little bit? Will that help really in the supply issue?
The mandate is not quite as inflexible as some people think it is. There are some ways that you can moderate how much use one year, use a little bit less one year, a little bit more another year, and that means we can probably actually cut back our ethanol consumption this year a little bit without changing the rules.
Would that really make a big difference in terms? You said about 5 billion bushels that's going into ethanol, but then there's a product out the back door that's a substitute for soybeans.
Right.
So tell us a little bit about how that relationship would work.
Right. For every 56-pound bushel of corn, you get about 17 pounds of distiller's grains that comes out the other side of an ethanol plant, and that's a good substitute for both corn and soybean meal in feed rations. So roughly a third of the corn that goes in to make ethanol still comes back out as livestock feed ultimately.
So if we reduced ethanol, there'd be less of that available, which would put more pressure on soybeans.
There would be a little bit different pressure on soybeans, and yes, this is one of the reasons why soybean markets are doing what they're doing.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about farmers. I farm. We're going to probably get into some crop insurance. We'll see where we're at because we haven't finished harvest yet. Is this going to be a disastrous year for a lot of farmers?
It's going to be a bad year for a lot of farmers, but it's not quite as bad as it could have been. The fact that prices appear to be quite a bit higher for this year's crop than last year's crop means that people will make up on price part of what they lose on quantities. Of course, it doesn't do you any good if you have no crop to harvest at all. Mm-hmm. But if you're someone who at least has a moderate crop this year, the higher prices will help. And of course, crop insurance plays a big role too.
Well, I was going to mention that one of the provisions in crop insurance, at least an option, is a harvest priced option, which pretty high percentage of farmers, I believe, are on that. And so if they are drawing some crop insurance, that's probably going to be a help, isn't it?
Right, yeah. So the loss that you have, you'll get paid at the harvest time price, essentially, if you have the most common policy. And that will be a significant amount of money for a lot of producers.
25 or 30% higher than the price that was projected in the spring, if I'm not mistaken.
That's correct. That's correct.
What about the livestock industry? Missouri is a big cattle state. On Craigslist in August, there was hundreds of cattle available for sale, and the sale barns in southern Missouri were filled with cattle, going to 2-day sales, all kinds of issues. What's this going to do to the nation's cow herd?
The cow herd was already being reduced by droughts in previous years, and then we had been expecting to stabilize numbers and maybe start to grow them again. This year's drought, of course, changes that. With high forage prices, high corn prices, the attractiveness of keeping cattle around is not what it was. So we're going to see fewer beef cattle in the years ahead. That's going to mean higher beef prices eventually for consumers.
I believe, if I'm not mistaken, going into the year, lowest cattle numbers since the 50s. Is that about right?
It's a long time ago since we had the kind of cattle numbers we have today.
We're taking significant reductions from that as well.
Taking reductions from those levels.
What about the pork industry?
Pork industry, again, we probably have more supplies this year than we might have guessed, given how high prices are. but nevertheless, we probably going to have a little bit less production we would have had, and therefore higher prices in 2013 than we would have had otherwise.
And the poultry, who's a big chunk of our corn from Missouri, corn and soybeans both, goes into the poultry industry. What's going to happen there?
Yeah, it used to be very predictable that poultry production would grow every year. And we've been growing chicken production and consumption year over year for several decades. That kind of ground to a halt the last several years, and this year we'll probably see less chicken production and higher prices.
One of the things you mentioned is exports. How much of our corn and soybeans goes to export?
A lot of it is exported corn. We used to export over 2 billion bushels. This year maybe as little as 1.25 billion bushels, so we've sharply reduced our corn exports because of these higher prices. Soybeans would continue to be a major exporter right now because there were small crops in South America last year. We're about the only game in town, so we're selling exports of soybeans very rapidly. That'll probably grind to a halt when the South American crop comes in.
For our overall economy, those exports are quite a big important part of our trade deficit, aren't they?
Right, yeah, the U.S. is actually a net exporter of agricultural products in total, so we sell more agricultural products overseas than we buy food products from other countries.
So will those exports be reduced then because of this shorter crop? I mean, the higher prices, that's kind of how it all rations out, isn't it?
Right, we'll see a lower quantity being exported, but because of the higher prices, it may well be the value of our exports may be the same or even higher than in previous years.
I know there's an annual projection of net farm income, and even with all these problems, because of the prices, it's actually looking pretty decent for farmers nationally, isn't it?
Right, yeah, for crop producers as a whole, for the country as a whole, it's going to be probably a relatively good year from a financial standpoint. Livestock producers, not so much. And for crop producers, of course, it depends on who you are, where you are, what your crop size was.
The individual is going to be really a critical issue there.
Right.
This is good timing. I think as we're taping this, we're visiting with, or the Congress has refused to pass, or failed to pass, I guess might be a better term, failed to pass an extension of any kind of the farm bill. So we're kind of in uncharted territory with that farm bill expiring at the end of 2012.
That's right. The current farm bill technically expires on September 30th. There are different provisions of the bill that go a little bit longer. So for most of the major crop provisions, there's nothing really dramatic that happens until next spring. Dairy is an exception to the rule where the dairy program actually, one part expires already at the end of September. Most of the other provisions of the dairy title will expire at the end of the year.
And if I understand right, that could, if it is expired and Congress doesn't do anything, there's going to be a big change in the dairy business.
If Congress fails to act at all, we would revert back to the Farm Law of 1949. And that would result in much, much higher support levels for milk in particular in the near term.
About triple the current prices almost?
Roughly triple the current support price, double the current market price.
And that would be good probably for some dairy farmers who are buying $8 corn, but not necessarily good for consumers and taxpayers?
I don't think it's an outcome most people really want to see.
Yeah. And what about the other provisions? We've got some farm legislation. There's been some talk about some changes. Any big changes for the crop farmers on their support prices?
Sure. If the bills that were passed by the Senate and by the House Ag Committee, if those are a guide at where we might be going in the Farm Bill debate ahead of us, we probably are looking at the end of the direct payment program. That's a program that's for the last 15 years has made annual payments to farmers based on how many acres they used to plant. That program may disappear and be replaced by other programs that are tied to market prices or revenues in a given year.
Hopefully we'll still get our checks. I feel sort of bad to be a farmer and be drawing some of these subsidies. I've seen several articles talking about the overall economy and especially the government budget. None of them are too excited about farm subsidy payments. We've got a lot of viewers out there on both sides, probably some farmers watching, probably some consumers, a lot of taxpayers watching. Tell us a little bit about how that all works.
Well, the subsidies that the producers receive today are much smaller as a share of their income than would have been the case 10 or 20 years ago. So if you look at the overall picture, producers get maybe $10 to $12 billion a year in direct payments from the government in one form or another. That compares to levels of gross receipts from sales that push $400 billion in a good year. So it's a much smaller share of producer income than it once was. It can still be very important, can still be the difference between profit and loss for some producers, but it's not quite as important as it once was.
One of the things that's under attack by some congressmen, particularly on the conservative side, is crop insurance, which is also subsidized. Don't know any other word to use. Those crop insurance payments are subsidized to the farmer, or their premiums are subsidized. Would that make a significant budget impact?
Yeah, if you were to change the crop insurance program, we are going to be spending about $4 or $5, $6 billion a year in premium subsidies every year going forward. In a year like this, we'll have a lot of indemnities paid out to farmers for losses, and most of those indemnities will ultimately be borne by taxpayers. So in a year like this, it is a significant draw on the federal budget. Average year, not quite so much.
We're approaching what they have termed the fiscal cliff at the end of the year if Congress can't seem to get together with the president and make some decisions. What would the impact be on agriculture?
If there's no agreements whatsoever, and then we are talking about significant increases in taxes, significant reductions in government spending across the board, that would happen in January. If that's just a temporary thing and we fix it all in late January, February, maybe it's not quite such a huge deal. But if it were to persist for several months, on the other hand, it could be a major drag on the economy.
I know one of the arguments in the Congress is about food stamps. Food stamps are a part of the agricultural bill. Some people don't realize that. But there's a lot of talk about, with the economy, lots more people are on food stamps than used to be. Is that two questions. Is that a budget impact, number one? And how important is that for the demand for farm products like meat and milk and eggs?
Sure, there's roughly $80 billion a year being spent currently on the food stamp program. So it's grown greatly in the last several years, not so much because of changes in law, but just because of the poor economy. More folks are on food stamps now than was the case previously. That's a very significant share of the overall USDA budget. Of the Farm Bill, it's roughly 80% of the Farm Bill spending that's projected, so it is a very big deal from a budgetary perspective. In terms of its effects on the ag sector, certainly people receiving food stamps have more money to spend on food than they would have otherwise. They're going to buy a little bit more expensive food than they might have been able to otherwise, and that on balance is going to be a positive thing for producers.
Those child nutrition programs and the food stamp program, a WIC program, et cetera, have been around for a long time, and in a time when we're looking at obesity and diet issues, those seem like they'd be pretty important to keep around.
They are important programs. Just how you manage them, of course, has been very controversial. Should we be trying to make changes to do things to reduce obesity in the way we manage those programs? One of the big questions.
It's kind of a government interference issue as well, isn't it? Let's talk about the economy overall. I know I've argued with my friends that because the farm economy is still pretty strong, good net incomes and so on, that we'll keep the John Deere plants busy and the Chevy truck factory busy. Is the agriculture economy big enough to have a serious impact on the overall economy?
It's probably not so important that it's going to affect the national economy very much, but certainly in more rural parts of the country, it is very, very important. If you're in rural Missouri, if you're in rural Iowa, rural North Dakota, it's going to be a big deal what happens to the farm economy, not just for you on the farm, but for all your neighbors as well.
So let's talk a little bit about the overall economy. It's tough enough to try to concentrate on corn or livestock prices, but I'm going to ask you to use your big crystal ball now and look. Is the economy genuinely improving?
That's really the $64 question right now. There do appear to be some positive signs. We have seen some signs that we're getting employment picking up in some parts of the country for some areas. We've also seen maybe a bottom of the housing market in large parts of the country. So those are good things. The stock market is doing reasonably well. So there's a number of positive aspects out there, but we still have far more folks unemployed. We still have a lot of slack capacity across the economy, and things are not getting better as fast as anybody would be satisfied with.
I'm going to ask you to get an even bigger crystal ball and look at. I know one of the problems is China, the European crisis. Tell us a little bit about what you see there, because that has a big. China's economy has become a real driver for some of these higher prices for corn and soybeans, hasn't it?
Right. Yeah. China accounts for more than 60% of all the soybeans imported in the world. So what happens there matters tremendously for soybean markets, obviously, but also for agricultural markets in general. And we often think of China as being a major competitor, and of course it is for many, many products, but in agriculture it's mostly a major market for the United States. So we actually, we benefit in agriculture from having a strong Chinese economy. There's been some slowdown in the Chinese economy, but slowing to maybe 7 or 8% a year growth instead of the 8, 10%, 12% growth they had.
Sounds phenomenal compared to our 2 or 3% growth.
Right. The European economy, of course, has real challenges right now with the debt crisis in Greece and other countries there. They've made some steps that appear to be at least stabilized things for the time being, but by no means have we taken care of all the problems that exist there. More crises could happen in front of us.
One of the things that I see is as the world economy improves, there's more of a demand for meat products, milk and eggs, that sort of thing. A little higher quality protein than maybe the rice and wheat that people are on subsistence with. That makes a big impact on us as well, doesn't it?
You bet. When folks in China, when folks in other countries eat more meat, that means they got to have more livestock being produced somewhere in the world. That means more livestock have to be fed something, so there's more corn and soybean meal demand around the world. And that drives up prices here in Missouri.
That's a big part of our demand for soybeans, isn't it?
You bet.
And soybeans are are they Missouri's number one crop? Is that right?
Missouri, yeah, number one crop in Missouri is soybeans, both by acreage in terms of value.
So what happens in China has a lot of impact in what happens in some areas in rural Missouri, doesn't it?
You bet. What happens to Chinese consumers matters to everybody here in Missouri.
So what do you see ahead? The Fed just announced this easing of the money supply a little bit, QE3, I think they call it. What do you see in your crystal ball looking out over the next few years?
The Fed is definitely trying to do what it can to prop up the economy, to give a little bit of stimulus to the economy. Whether it'll work, we'll see. I mean, like a lot of folks think that while there may be an impact, it'll probably be relatively small. There are folks who remain concerned about possible inflation in the future, but so far inflation has not really been a major problem overall. We still have very modest rates of inflation in the U.S. economy.
One of the reasons that farmers feel pretty good about things may be the price of the land that they own is going up. Now, if you're interested in expanding and buying more, it's pretty tough. Land prices have just gone crazy, haven't they?
Yeah, we've seen a huge increase in land values. Some of it makes sense. Again, we've had very good returns to most crop production in this country. We have very low interest rates, so that combination tends to push values higher. That doesn't mean that all the values we have out there are where they should be. There's probably some folks who are being a little bit brave in what they've decided to do in land markets.
Well, I follow some auctions in Iowa where they had $10,000 and $20,000 an acre of land. I don't know if any place in Missouri has gotten that high, but what the St. Louis Federal Reserve, I think, came out with a forecast for at least a chunk of Missouri, looking at pretty sharply higher land prices.
Yeah, there's been a big increase across all the Midwest. Missouri maybe not quite as much as some neighboring states, but yes, big increases here as well. There's some vulnerability in front of us if we were ever having a run up in interest rates or a turn down the farm economy.
I was going to mention that the interest rates, I remember living through the 80s when we had sharply higher rates, and I guess that was a Fed effort to stop inflation, and we had interest rates go crazy, and that really put a damper on land prices. So these things can change pretty fast, can't they?
Yes. Yeah, if there was a significant increase in interest rates, we'd probably see a sharp downturn in land values as well.
So what do you, let's again put on your crystal ball and look towards next year. What are you looking at next year? Looking at the futures prices, they're stronger by quite a bit than they were this time last year. What do you see happening?
We have a strong incentive to produce as many crops as we can around the world, not just in the United States, but everywhere. So we'll have big acreage again next year, probably for all of our major crops. Right now, it's tough to predict which crop will win the battle for acreage next spring. It depends on what happens in South American crop this fall, for example.
Well, that's one of the things that we all kind of wrestle with. Because we're kind of short on all three major commodities, and then if you throw rice and cotton in it, everybody's competing for acres, which really leads to a pretty aggressive price structure, at least in the winter when farmers are making those plans.
That's right. We might expect cotton acreage, for example, to go down next year because we do have more adequate cotton supplies than we do for some other crops. But cotton's relatively small in the U.S. farm economy in terms of acreage. So there's only so many acres out there for planting corn, soybeans, and wheat.
And there's certain areas that are more adapted to those corn and soybeans, and the competition in those areas is going to be pretty tight, isn't it?
Right.
So do you want to make any predictions? I know USDA had projected this marketing year originally. I think they said $8.90 was going to be the upper end. They've lowered that recently. What range do you see for these basic commodities over the next few months?
Sure. We put out some projections in the month of August that showed an average corn price of about $8 a bushel for this year. I think looking at where things stand today, we might be a little bit lower than that given current information, but still, a price over $7 a bushel for corn is a record high price if we were to have that for a season average. For soybeans, about $16. Again, we'll probably see prices highest this time of year and probably declining into the spring, provided there's a good sized crop in South America coming online.
So we're going to have to watch when I watch the weather forecast every night, I watch it for southern Missouri. I need to start watching it for Brazil and Argentina now.
Very definitely.
There's a lot to cover for me in my age. That's what about wheat? This is wheat planting time in Missouri. We're looking at pretty strong prices for wheat as well, aren't we?
Right. Wheat prices are being primarily supported by the high corn prices. We don't have nearly the shortage of wheat around the world as we do of corn, but you can't have wheat too cheap relative to corn if people start feeding wheat.
Well, I know that there was a lot of substitution here this summer when a big hog mill close to us was buying lots and lots of wheat because the corn had gotten so high.
If anything, we're probably surprised there hasn't been even more of that than we've observed.
So if you could judge over your lifetime as an ag economist, where we are in terms of relative health for farmers, or financial health for farmers, where would you place this?
Well, again, I think for most crop producers, it's been a run of relatively good years here now. Since about 2007, we haven't had maybe but 1 year that wasn't a decent year in terms of prices, at least. Obviously, having 3 straight years now of subpar yields for corn and soybeans, has been a major drag for a lot of producers affected. But overall, the crop sector is doing reasonably well, as evidenced by high land values. On the other hand, the livestock sector has had more ups and downs. Those high feed costs have come at a cost to the livestock sector, and some of those folks are having a much tougher time.
We don't have time to get into global warming. That'd be another show. But it seems like to me our weather is more volatile than it's ever been, which leads to more volatility in prices. How do we deal with this volatility? Do you see that continuing?
I think the volatility is definitely going to be there, certainly in the markets anyway. Whether we have the kind of weird weather patterns in the future that we've had the last couple, 3 years, we'll see. We hadn't had even 2 straight years of subpar corn yields in the last 20 years. Now we've had 3 straight.
Yeah, they keep projecting an uptrend, but we're kind of going the other way the last 3 years.
Right.
And so, what about acreage? Where are we going to get the extra acreage we need? Is CRP still going to be a factor?
There may be a few less acres of CRP next year than there were this year, but it's not enough to make a huge difference in the big picture. We'll take some acres out of cotton and put them into corn and soybeans. We'll take some acres and shift them around elsewhere, but we're probably not going to have the potential to have big increases in all 3 of those crops at the same time this year. There's not enough acres to go around.
And what about the livestock industry in Missouri? I think we had, for a while, we were number 2 in cattle. We dropped, and Texas and Oklahoma had a drought. Are we still going to be in that top tier for cattle country?
We're still going to be an important cattle state, but yes, we have dropped in relative importance given the changes that have occurred in the last couple, 3 years. If we get better weather next spring, better pasture conditions, we may can handle more cattle here in Missouri again.
Well, hay, we haven't even talked about the hay crop. I mean, nationally, the hay crop's way down, and hay's very expensive. It makes it, a cow's got to be worth quite a bit more next spring to make all that work, don't they?
That's right. No, very definitely. Forage supplies in general have been a huge problem this year.
Well, I don't know if we'll have you back in January or not. Things are so volatile, we may have to have you back again and give us another forecast and give us your best advice on where we're going. But we really appreciate you coming. I'm afraid that's all the time we have for tonight. But I'd like to say thanks again to Dr. Westhoff for joining us. And thank you to our viewers for tuning in to Show Me Ag. We hope you'll tune in next time for another look at a topic touching rural Missouri. For everyone here at KMOS and myself, good night. We're also very interested in what you have to say. So if you have any feedback you'd like to share with us, email us at showmeag@kmos.org, or you can find us on Facebook.